Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. Today, we're going to be talking about another book. The book is called The Book of Vows, the Mahabharata Trilogy. And I have the author of the book with me, Amit Majumdar. Amit, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled.
So, Amit, this is your first time on the podcast. So, I'll request you to maybe we can start over here. Can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, your journey?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Amit Majumdar. I was born and raised in the United States, but for about a year and a half, we moved back to India. So I did second standard and third standard in India, in Ahmedabad, India. But then we just came right back to Ohio, and I've lived in Ohio my whole life. And I'm a poet, a novelist, an essayist. I also translated the Gita. And my most recent book that I published in India, I published different bodies of work in America and in India. And my most recent book in India is this one, the Book of Vows, which is the first volume in a three-part retelling of the Mahabharata. And in my day job, I work as a diagnostic radiologist, and that's basically what I do and who I am.
Now, that's a lot of work, being a diagnostic radiologist in the day and then translating the Bhagavad Gita. Now, how did you manage that?
Do you mean from like a time management kind of perspective,
Yeah,
or?
man. So, where did you learn? Where did you learn Sanskrit? Because I mean, how did you go about
Yeah.
the
So,
translation?
so for me, Sanskrit is not, it's not something that I speak very well. It's something that's very textually oriented. And so I just used a lot of textual resources, textbooks. My wife took Sanskrit in college, so I had her syllabi and everything like that. So I just went word by word by word for years through the Gita, looking up etymologies and just basically making a research project out of each and every word. And then that's basically how I engaged with that text to create the translation. And then I basically spend a lot of time ever since I was probably 12, 13 years old. I just spend a lot of time reading all the time and writing. And so that's how I kind of got interested in, and I've always been interested in the Indian traditions, the Hindu tradition, literary tradition, poetic tradition, and philosophical traditions. And so that's kind of been side by side with my love of literature in general. And so it's basically what I do with my free time. So I do a lot of work, for radiology and everything like that, but almost all of my free time is not, I don't watch sports a lot. I don't watch movies very much. I don't watch TV very much. I'm just like very drilled down, like very focused on literary stuff.
So, so the biggest question when it comes to translations, we'll get into the book. They always say is that, oh, you're not qualified under blah 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 the thing,
Right.
or you're not trained under a university in India, like a
Right.
proper school, Sanskrita school in India. So how do you respond to those kinds of
Right. So I think that there are different ways that we can define qualification. And for certainly from some people's perspective, I'm just a guy off the street who made, a several years long study of the Gita, and there's no real authority or guru or anybody who sort of taught me. And the volume that is, it's God song. It has a commentary, and really what by what authority does one even write a commentary on the Gita, right? And at the same time, you can say that, well, different translators bring different qualifications to the task. So most of the translations that I've come across, they're written by people for whom English language, like the traditions of English language poetry, are either alien or not even part of their mindset. So it'll be like a prose translation. But my translation, it's into verse. It's into a very faithful verse. A lot of times I replicate the word order. I replicate alliteration. I replicate sonic elements, and those are calculations that frequently translators who are translating into a treatise like prose aren't going to even think about. And then there's a question of study, right? And abhyas, and all of that is something that uh, you can, it can be something that if you are doing it in a very, very curricularized format, in the end, it's something that is pre-existing. And I think I value every individual's unique experience of the Gita. And so if someone else who has no formal training in Indian philosophy or the Gita or some specific sampradaya has their ideas on the Gita, I'm actually interested in that because I think that everyone's experience brings them to a point, and then how does the Gita engage with that particular life, engage with that particular background? Someone who's not from India, someone who's from maybe grew up in the United States like myself, someone who might have grown up in Britain or Europe or Australia or anywhere. Non-Indians. I love talking to non-Indian Hindus about their experience of Hinduism or the experience of the Gita. These are all very fascinating backgrounds and fascinating ways in which people approach it from different origins, and there's no one authoritative engagement with it. And I think that's something that's valuable in its own right.
So now let's come to the current trilogy. Obviously, we're going to talk about part one of the trilogy, the Book of Vows. Now, how did you come up with the idea of writing this trilogy?
Well, I've always been very interested, as I said, in poetry, and that's been a lifelong love of mine. Um, most of people think of poetry, they think of like a 1 or 2 page kind of poem that talks about personal subjective states, emotional states. But from the very beginning, I was in love with epic poetry and dramatic poetry, the kind of older forms of poetry where it was married to storytelling. And I was always very fascinated by how verse and poetry and the poetic art could dovetail with storytelling. And so I was intimidated by the text of the Mahabharata for a very long time because it's so vast, right? It's so
Yeah.
huge. It's not like the Iliad. It's not like the Odyssey. I think the Iliad and the Odyssey are they're very tiny elements of the larger Homeric cycle, the larger mythological world of the Trojan War, everything before it, everything after it, and during it. And so I mostly stuck with a lot of Western epics. As time went on, I felt that I know the story of the Mahabharata, but I'm always getting it secondhand, whether it's from the television or someone else's retelling. And I felt that I wanted to engage with Vyasa. I didn't read this in the original Sanskrit or anything. I read a variety of translations and abridgments of the original text. And as I explored the epic in its original form, a lot of my preconceived ideas about the original text vanished and they were replaced with a differing way of looking at it. And as those revelations came to me, I felt compelled to give it form and to create a work of art in English, in contemporary English, that reflected some of the things that I was seeing and experiencing in Vyasa.
So let's talk about translations now. Once again, when we have this translation subject, right? So I'm someone who reads religious texts a lot. I've read the Mahabharata, I've read the Ramayana, I've read multiple translations myself. I've been like doing this for a while. I started reading religion at the age of 2021. Started reading Hindu texts at the age of 23, 24. And since then, I've
Mhm.
spent years reading these texts, and I always try to use multiple translations. Now, my point of view is
Mhm.
that would knowing Sanskrit at a fluent level be the best option, where you read the text in Sanskrit and then that's when you get the meaning? Yes, I understand that point of view. But to say that, oh, you will never understand a text by reading a translation because there could be nuances, I think that's a little bit of a cop out. Yes, ideal state is ideal state, but if you read two, three translations or four translations, you can actually get a very significant chunk of what the text means to say. And that's why you read multiple translations, because what happens is the intention of the author translating also creeps into the text, and the sampradaya they belong
Sure.
to also matters.
Right.
Or sometimes, the translator might be a Marxist, and they will have their Marxist dogma in the translation
Right.
itself. Now, in your case, which translations did you refer to, and how did you check for these biases?
I think that I first of all I agree with basically everything that you said, and I think that I have a very very deep relationship to, for example, Greek and Latin literature, which I've been reading for years, for decades, really, and I've never read those in the original. I just read different translations of them. The ones that I read for the Mahabharata were primarily two, which was John Smith's version for Penguin Classics. That translates about, I think it translates a percentage of the text. It's an abridgment as well as a translation, and it kind of summarizes the parts that he abridges. He didn't strike me as having much of an ideological axe to grind. I can usually tell when someone does from the way from well, first of all, from their introductions, it usually becomes very evident. But that was a pretty good one. Bibek Debroy has translated in multiple volumes. That's the entire thing, and then there's Narasimhan, CV Narasimha, which is a much shorter version, also an abridgment. And those are the ones that that I accessed to basically get the story straight, get the characters straight, and get the feel. And I do feel like in the end, everyone is going to have their own engagement with the epic. And I don't think that there's any one exhaustive or all-encompassing telling possible of it, just because there's so much subjective encounter involved with the epic. But I definitely have created, in the trilogy, I've created a work that kind of reflects my personal, encounter with the epic for sure.
So were there specific instances when you read these multiple translations where you had these moments where, wow, they mean different things? And how did you navigate those moments, if you don't mind me asking?
No, I don't. I don't feel like there were really divergences among those versions. To be honest with you, I feel like most of the divergences that I experienced were between my pre-existing notions of the epic and pre-existing notions of the characters that were basically either false in some way or idealized in some way. That did not track to how the characters were in Vyasa, or in their sort of original or earliest expressions textually in the textual record.
So now let's get into why should one read the Mahabharata? It's such a long, 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 long text. I mean, just by the sheer volume of pages, if
Right.
if I was to, I would never recommend someone to start with the Mahabharata, because they will never read anything Hindu then. You should start with something smaller, a shorter text. Maybe the Bhagavad Gita is a great starting point. Then you could maybe
Mhm.
jump into something longer. Then maybe you can read a few Upanishads, the principal Upanishads, the 10 or 14
Mhm.
principal Upanishads. And then, because the Mahabharata, the sheer volume of the Mahabharata, right? The number of
Right.
pages, the number of shlokas, then the translations,
Right.
and then the subsequent commentaries associated with the Mahabharata. It can
Right.
be very intimidating to an average person, to an average Hindu, or to an average person who's even non-Hindu for that matter.
Right.
So, why did you decide to take the biggest text?
So I think that and I talk about this in the introduction that I have for this first volume. The So, like, the Iliad and the Odyssey are individual episodes from the larger Homeric cycle. And the Homeric cycle actually included about a dozen epics by different hands that dealt with, the run up to Paris's abduction of Helen, that included various adventures during the siege of Troy, that included the homegoing the attempts to go home on the part of the various warriors after the war. So it wasn't just Odysseus's story. They all, Ajax had his own epic, and different characters had their own epics in the ancient Greek corpus of the Homeric cycle. And the Mahabharata is basically the entire. It's as if you took the entire Homeric cycle and regarded it as one thing, and that's why you have everything that goes from Satyavati and Shantanu and all of these characters all the way down to the aftermath of the Yadavas having their mutual slaughter and the death of Krishna, and the Pandavas going to and Yudhishthir taking his dog with him to heaven, or trying to take his dog with him to heaven. That everything is there. Everything is there in the Mahabharata, and I think that that's what makes it so intimidating. And I think that if you took all of the Homeric cycle epics and put them in one book, it would be very intimidating as well. The initial way in which I tried to write the Mahabharata, because I kind of contemplated a long time, how to do it. The initial way I tried to do it was actually to take individual episodes and create Homeric style epics that focused in just on, say, the encounter between Arjuna and Karna, right? Or another one where, based on, there's this old Sanskrit play called the Urubhanga, which is about Duryodhan after he gets his thighs shattered. And then, you can take that one moment and drill down on it and expand it and have an entire, have much of the epic told through flashbacks and encounters and this and that relative to one particular event. But it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because the Mahabharata, unlike some of the simpler epics of the West, like the Song of Roland or Beowulf, or the poem of the Cid, the Mahabharata is this densely networked story. Okay, and I think that all the curses, boons, vows are made along the course of the epic. They end up having these direct, results and encounters on Kurukshetra at the end, at the climactic battle, at the climactic war. And so I felt that I had to basically do it all, do it whole, and that's why I engaged with the whole epic, to see the networking, to tease out the lines of force from beginning to end, and then create a version of the epic where it was efficiently told in a way that was, in my opinion, true to the complexity of it, but at the same time in a size and mode and feel that is something that's accessible to both Indians and non-Indians reading in English. Because I am an American, and it is kind of something that I do keep it both an Indian audience in mind, but I also keep an American audience in mind, and that's why the in the book itself I have these summaries before so before every set of chapters I'll have like a summary sequence where I'll have like sequence 1, how Bhishma and Vyasa come to be. And then I'll explain what is going to come over the next few chapters. And I'll talk about, and I'll list the characters who are going to show up again. And I keep this very orderly for non-Hindu readers, non-Indian readers. I think that it's easy to take a certain amount of knowledge for granted, but and I try to avoid doing that so that it could be something that people who know the epic can enjoy, but at the same time, people who are unfamiliar with the epic can get into it. And if they lose their place or they put it down and come back, they can sort of follow the sequence, all the summaries up to the point where they are, and then continue reading again.
Maybe we can drill down on this subject of differences between cultures, and when, as a writing style, you have to incorporate both these. So could you explain that with an example or something, like how would, let's say, an average American Now, I understand where you're coming from, is because I myself live in America and Canada for 5 months every year. Now, I understand
Mhm.
how people perceive certain words very differently over there culturally, in comparison to over here. But like, what were these things that you have to keep in mind when you wrote this book? Like, are there any instances like that?
I think from a creative standpoint, it's not necessarily a micro managed thing. It's not like when you're creating it, it's not as though you're mentally thinking to yourself, okay, would someone who is unfamiliar with the epic, who is of this background, understand this particular reference? I think that when you as a writer, when you have an audience in mind, um, all of those decisions happen almost at a subconscious level. So it's a little bit hard for me to pinpoint exactly how my notion of wanting to write an epic that is accessible to both Hindus and non-Hindus, Indians and non-Indians, directly affects the nitty gritty of the story. But I can tell you that if I that a lot of what it involves is not taking things for granted and not taking knowledge for granted. And so it's easy for when we say Krishna, it's very easy for us to mentally have an image of a very charming and handsome and an attractive uh, person who has a certain way of interacting with people, who has a certain wit and a certain charm and a certain sublimity and all of that, right? And what I've noticed in retellings is that a lot of times it doesn't come out in how he speaks. It doesn't come out in the subtleties of interactions because take it for granted when you say Krishna and you have him, you mentally think of a certain way that even his lines are delivered. So in the Book of Vows, when Krishna shows up, when he has interactions, I try and bring some of that wit, some of that tightness, some of that epigrammatic tightness, some of that charm into the descriptions and into the dialogue. And so it's that sort of that it happens more at that level rather than a specific micro decision of this or that. It's more of a global thing. And I think Duryodhan's another example of that. Like you have to have his speech be, have his speech be a little, you just kind of have to you have to always remember that the word Duryodhan may not mean to a stranger what it means to you it means to me or you because of our familiarity, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah, that would be a very interesting case when somebody reads your summary and they're not from an Indian background and they've not read the Mahabharata, and they kind of start liking some of the characters that we don't like. That would be a very interesting conversation to have.
You know what? But I tell you one thing I really like about the Mahabharata is that a lot of characters they have redeeming qualities and it's ambiguous. They have a lot of the characters have characters that you would like and then things you would dislike, and it's like that in real life with people, right? And I thought that was a wonderful thing, a wonderful element of the epic. Really, is that Karna, even Duryodhan's the first person that Yudhishthir sees in heaven, right? So I like the ambiguities of the epic. I like the contradictions of the characters. And there are points where Duryodhan's complaining about Krishna, and it's kind of like you kind of see his perspective. You can see his perspective. And so that's one of the things that I like about this particular epic is that it's not necessarily hobbits and orcs. You know what I'm saying? It's not necessarily pure good versus evil, and I think that's a very heroic age ethos to it.
Yeah, why call it the Book of Vows?
It's because it's one of the main thematic through lines of this portion of the epic, beginning with Bhishma's vow, and then there's a whole bunch of there's various other vows that occur over the course of the epic that culminate in the vows that are taken after the dice game and as the Pandavas are going into exile, right? So Bhim makes a vow about, I'm gonna break that thigh that you kind of clapped your thigh, and Draupadi's like, I'm not gonna bind up my hair until I'm avenged, and all the different Pandavas make various vows as they're leaving, and the Kauravas are kind of mocking them as they're going, and so the Book of Vows, it sort of, the main action begins with Bhishma's vow, to relinquish his inheritance and relinquish the throne, and not marry, and then that's at the beginning of the Book of Vows, and then and at the end of the Book of Vows, the Book of Vows ends after the dice game and as the Pandavas are going to exile, and so so it ends with them making those vows as well, and so that it's kind of bookended by vows.
In fact, you know why I was fascinated, and let me explain why I asked you this question. So, in the book, you start by saying everything begins with a vow. Words were everything back then: honor, self discipline, intensity, power. You said your will out loud. I'm going to do this. Once you said it, your will was out in the open. All the worlds and all the universes, all the gods and all the goddesses, all your ancestors and all your descendants compared what you said you would do with what you did. Are you as good as your word, or aren't you? You could break the vow, but you couldn't unsay it. Now let me explain where I come from. I'm born and raised in India. Yes, I have lived in the West. I live partially in the West, but there is a significant difference between Indian culture and Western culture. I come from a business background. Um, there is something about India and the West that is even today very different. It's not like India is not a democracy which does not have courts or police or everything. But listen, the level of law and order in India is not where we would say the level of law and order is in the West, right? So, India, even today, it's in a very funny way. In Hindi, we have this word where we say, Zaban ki कीमत होती है. The tongue has a value. That, let's say, if I was
Mhm.
getting into a business deal with someone, and I would tell that person, listen, I'm going to start working with you. When will you pay me? And that person would say, sir, I'll pay you in 30 days. Sometimes it gets late, sometimes it might get early, and you manage around that. Now in India, why the Book of Vows and why this is very important is because how Indian society is even today. So where in my trade, or old trade, now I'm a podcaster in textiles, how it used to be is in Kalba Devi in Mumbai. It's a big textile market. If somebody was a defaulter who would dishonor his vows, who would dishonor his commitments, there was a big board in Kalba Devi that would say, this person is a defaulter, do not do business with him. And that's not
Mm,
that
mhm.
that's not how they do it in the West, right? In the West, you
Mhm.
sue the person, you go to the courts are, do the decision.
Mhm.
Now that is such a gigantic difference between the two cultures. And when I was reading your book, and when I started reading this, the first thing that came to my mind is this. Now, how important, how would a Westerner react to this, a Westerner living today who says, hey, if you didn't honor, I would sue you. Maybe in let's say in America down south, maybe people would understand the value of vows, because if you look at anthropological and social science literature, they say the south is more a culture of honor in comparison to
Honor
the
culture.
other parts.
Right. Yeah. It's I love that. I love that contrast, and I love that experience, because that's a world that I'm not familiar with. So I love hearing about it. Um, I think that uh, I do agree with you about the South having more of an honor culture, but the question is, I guess, um, whether what your experiences in the business world necessarily translate to the interpersonal experiences of Americans within their particular you know communities, right? And I feel as though what you're referring to is related to this in a business context, but the norms related to business in America do go through the legal system. Whereas the notion, the interpersonal aspect of, can I trust, if someone says that they're going to be here, or do this with me at a certain time, a certain place, can I trust them to show up? If someone says that, they're going to, help me out in this way, and, can I rely on them or not? That's a very universal thing, in my opinion. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with honor culture or lack of honor culture or business practices, I think it's a very, very universal element of human interactions of is this person's word trustworthy or not? And in my experience, I've lived basically my whole life in the United States, other than I mentioned for a year and a half, I moved to India. We moved to India when I was a kid. And we came right back to the exact same place in Ohio. There's not that much of a difference culturally between Americans that I've grown up among and live among, and Indians, where at the interpersonal level, someone being as good as their word is a plus, and it is highly regarded, and it fosters trust, it fosters friendship. I mean, all those things are universal in my opinion.
Fair enough. I do understand where you're coming from, but this is something in my own personal journey. When I live here and in
Mhm,
the West, I find this contrast very obvious. Where over there,
mhm,
if the book says so, you just do it. It's that kind
mhm,
of a culture. Well, that's just the rule,
mhm,
so I do it. And over here, it's a very different thing. It's always constantly jostling with the reality around you, working
mhm,
around that. But now I want to jump into probably one of the most interesting titles of because you have a lot of chapters, right? You have small chapters that you've broken down, 20 plus
mhm,
chapters that you've written it
mhm,
in the book. Now,
mhm,
the perils of marrying a river. Now, that's a very interesting title that you have chosen for a
mhm,
chapter. So let's talk about that. So,
mhm.
what are the perils of marrying a river?
Well, I think if the so at so in the at one point, there's so it has to do with, well, there's a whole story related to that, which has to do with um, you know uh, uh, basically there are these eight Vasus, right? And so then Bhishma is one of them, and they are cursed to take birth. And so then the Ganga basically agrees to take form and then bear them and then drown them, and then that way their time on Earth is as short as possible. And so she tells her husband, I'm going to do, don't ask where I go after the birth. And he holds out. He holds out for a long time, but then when that last one, he can't do it. He can't hold out, and he basically does what it's kind of like in a fairy tale where you're asked to do that one thing you're not supposed to do, and everything would be okay if you just looked away. You didn't do what you're supposed to do. You did what you were told not to do. But then that's precisely what that character has to do, and so he does. He confronts her, and then that's basically why Bhishma survives. Um, uh, and he's not drowned, and then she takes him sort of back down, um, years later. And that's basically the perils of marrying a river, is that she's going to drown your first seven children.
Yeah, not not a fun fact. Now, when you talk about rivalries in your book, right? I think this was chapter 10. I could be wrong about the name of the chapter, but I think
I
chapter
don't exactly remember either. Yeah, rivalries.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So now rivalries are a very intrinsic part of human existence, right? We have rivals in different degrees and in different ways going throughout our life. Now, what do you think is the biggest lesson that comes from the Mahabharata, in your opinion, when it comes
yeah.
to handling competition? I'm not talking about because rivalries
Mhm.
in a very subtle way are also about competition, right? About how do we
Mhm.
deal with
Yeah,
someone who's sharing the pizza with us, who's sharing the space
right.
with us, who wants a piece of the pie, as they say.
Mhm,
so
mhm.
so, so how do we deal with that? How would the Mahabharata teach us to deal with rivalries?
Right. That's a wonderful and deep question, because rivalry in the end is one of the really strong through lines of the epic, right? Everyone knows about, the Pandavas and Kauravas is the main element, but then even within that, there are individual rivalries, Arjuna and Karna, Bhima and Duryodhan. There's also, the rivalries of, I guess, in Indraprastha and Hastinapur. There's also the there's just and then also you can, if you look at the actual time before the Pandavas and Kauravas are born, there's a rivalry sort of between Kunti and between Pandu and Dhritarashtra, because Dhritarashtra is blind, and then and Pandu. So there's all of this rivalry going on, and I think that one of the, it's hard to distill it down to a single lesson, but one of the things that I'll just point out relative to that, sort of a circuitous way of answering the question, because I don't know if I can necessarily distill it into a bullet point, if that's what you're looking for.
You can take your
But
time.
what's
You
that?
can take your
What's
time.
that?
You can take your time and
Yeah,
explain it.
sure, sure. So I mean, so one of the things that I think was very significant has to do with how, and I don't, it's not in this volume. It's in the next volume that's coming out next, which is called the Book of Discoveries. Um, it has to do with the inflexibility and the desire to take it all and have it all, which Duryodhana exhibits at the time where, in the very end, they try all these negotiations, and then it comes down to, hey, look, just give us 5 villages, right? And Krishna goes with this mission, and he does all this, and he tries to get these just 5 villages for the Pandavas, one for each Pandava. And even this is refused, right? Because there's a winner take all mentality here on the part of the Kauravas and the part of Duryodhana. And at that point, what's a very interesting thing is that Krishna, he actually tries to arrest Krishna, and then Krishna shows a very cosmic form of himself,
Hmm.
which is, so Arjuna is not the first person to see this cosmic form. It's actually Duryodhana, and he's kind of, he doesn't necessarily react with the same intensity as Arjuna, and I think that's actually a significant point as well. The vision is only as powerful as the recipient of the vision, but I think that winner take all mentality also holds true at the dice game, which does occur in the Book of Vows. The Book of Vows kind of finishes with the dice game, where they're goading Yudhishthira to wager more and wager more, wager still more, and he ends up wagering everything, including his own relative, his own brothers, and his wife and everything. And this is a very, very and because they want it all, and they want to keep drawing him into that gambling game, that dice game, to get everything out of him. And this is also the winner take all mentality at play. And I think that that's one thing. And then the other thing has to do with which does occur in the Book of Vows, which is when they go to the, Yudhishthira builds this beautiful hall, and this is the one of the main thing that triggers Duryodhana's envy, and his sense of rivalry and his sense of being surpassed. And that involves, even though this is these are his own cousins, his own blood, he can't rejoice in their success. He cannot marvel at the beauty of what they have built for its own sake, because it makes him feel inadequate. And so when it comes to rivalry, I think that the Mahabharata in its own way is kind of telling us a few things. It's telling us, to try and distill it to a bullet point here, it's telling us, don't have a winner take all mentality. Try and share alike, and try and include the other person, have the other person, have the rival and yourself, win together, right? Win together. And I think that um, envy is poisonous. Envy is poisonous. I think that when your rival, and so think of it as from a literary standpoint, right? Let's say hypothetically somebody else created a retelling of the Mahabharata in 3 volumes and released their first volume in 2023, the same year as mine. and it was, say, the Book of Boons by somebody else. All right. And let's say it was genuinely better than mine. And everyone loved it far more than they loved mine. It's a bestseller. They're turning into a movie. And I pick it up and I'm all skeptical, and it ends up being truly beautiful and truly superior to mine in every way. At that point, I have a choice. I have a choice where I can experience envy and hatred and resentment and anger that this person, and I can deny that the beauty of that other rival's book and say that he must know, or she must know people, and he must have connections, and that's why they're hyping this book so much or something like that. Or I can admire what was done. I can admire what this person created and say, look, this person created something transcendently beautiful. I tried to do it. I did the best I could do. This person did the best they could do, and they did better than me. Let me learn from them. Let me internalize, their approach. Let me study their approaches, their techniques, their use of language, their characterization, the way they structure the story. Let me learn from that, and then maybe I'll become a better writer as a result. Maybe I'll write something in the future in which I try to rival. Maybe I'll write a Ramayana trilogy where I try and rival this, what they did with the Mahabharata, and maybe my work will be better as a result. You know, and I think that's kind of like, envy is poisonous, and there's a reason why, why wise people weren't warned against it, and it's because it stifles your learning. It stifles your ability to see excellence where it is and then emulate it and then pursue it, and be inspired to outdo yourself. That's the excellence of the rival should be an inspiration to outdo yourself and to improve,
You
to level up.
in a very interesting way, in your own book, the answer to the rivalry chapter is the partition chapter. And if you indulge in rivalry, you will end up in partition. Now, um irony of ironies, I don't know if again the Western world will understand this. The Indians get it very well, at
Mhm.
a political level, at a societal level, because of 1947, how rivalries led to a partition, and how as a society we still have trauma associated with the partition. Maybe the current generation that is born after the 90s or in the 2000s, they don't understand that, but definitely kids born before the 90s definitely understand the trauma associated with these things. And it's very interesting. Again, I'm wondering how the Western world would would react to your partition chapter, where the because again, right, it's a very individualistic society. You're 16, your parents tell you get the hell out of the house, go do your own
Mhm.
thing, fend for yourself. Inheritance is not your right. In fact, in a country like America, if you get inheritance above X million dollars, you're even taxed for it, because the whole idea
Mhm.
in the United States of America is that's something that you've not earned. It's your parents, right? So let me, the
Mhm.
government, take some chunk of it. I mean, I'm not justifying it, or in any way possible, because they're taxing an already taxed income in America, which I find very absurd. But the point is that how does one deal with this? How does one deal with partition? So how would the Mahabharata
I've
teach us?
written two novels about the partition of India. Just last year, I published The Map and the Scissors, which was about the rivalry between Jinnah and Gandhi. And my first novel in 2011 was also entitled Partitions, just like that chapter. I did that on purpose. And that was something that dealt more with the human impact of it. Map and the Scissors, which I published last year, was about the political run up to it and the rivalry between Jinnah and Gandhi. So I've studied the partition of India in great detail, and I've written a lot of pages about it. And the pages I've published in those two novels are a fraction of the amount I've actually written about it. So I've written a lot about it. I've also published some essays about it. And I think that, you know the the partitioning of India was a partition that was carried out. America had its own partition,
Hmm?
okay, and that was the United States Civil War in
Yeah.
the 1860s. And there's an alternative history where instead of Lincoln, they elect McClellan. McClellan was a very, very cautious general. He was afraid of fighting. He didn't want to lose people. He kind of had notions of maybe we should just give them their own country, and he was a very cautious kind of general. And there's alternative histories where Lincoln wasn't the man at that time. The South won a bunch of initial victories against the North. Okay, initially there's the Battle of Bull Run, Manassas Junction, a few other battles, skirmishes. The South was winning because they had the more martial culture. Okay, they were over 60%, I think 60 or 70% of officers at West Point were actually Southerners who then went to fight for the South. And so the South was looking like a strong horse early on, and there is a strong cultural memory in the United States of a sort of thwarted partition. Okay, and within American discourse, even today, there is a strong streak of red state, blue state. And that's not really a partition that can take place along geographic lines.
Yeah.
Simply, and that holds true in the South as well, by the way. So Birmingham, Alabama will vote blue, but everything around it will vote red. So that partition is not something that happens at the territorial level the way it threatened to happen in the 1860s.
Hmm.
However, partition is also something that happens in the mind, right? And in the end, the geographic or political manifestations of partition are a reflection of a psychological rupture in the community as a whole, in the national community as a whole. In India, this happened at the level of religion. With Islamic nationalism and the Pakistan movement with Jinnah. Within Pakistan, it later happened at a linguistic level. Okay, between Bengali and Urdu speaking West and Bengali speaking East. The rupture that led to the partition of India could very well happen again, because there is a psychological divide in the Indian psyche which can be easily worsened over time if interested political parties decide to exacerbate it. And that's how the Pakistan movement worked. In 1937, there was the Jinnah and the All India Muslim League did terribly in the Legislative Assembly elections. 10 years later, they successfully partitioned the country, right? Partitioned the British Raj. And that happened through rallies, speeches, propaganda, and an intensification of the divide that was already at some level there. Now, in the American context, Americans are no strangers to partition mentality and the division mentality. A lot of Americans are always talking about how polarized our society is. Those polarizations take different forms in different countries throughout the West, and I think, and throughout democracies in the West. I think that in America, because religion has been eclipsed, religious identities, state identities. In the Civil War, state identities were actually very, very powerful. A lot of people identified as a Virginian or an Ohioan or a New Yorker even more strongly than they identified as American. It's a very, it's a different world back then. But in America today, religious identities have been largely eclipsed.
Hmm.
And even in what I see personally in my own neighborhood, even racial antagonism is something is on life support. There's a lot of intermarriage. There's a lot of people who love artists and musicians of each other's races. The real divide is the left-right political divide. That's the shorthand that we use for it. There are a lot of different elements to the left and the right or what we call the left and the right, that basically determine how people sort and how people mentally divide themselves off from other people. So it doesn't happen at the level of religion in our country, but it does happen, and it is.
So before we wrap it up, one last question, Amit. So what was the one moment where you were writing this book, where you just sat back and asked yourself, "Gosh, how profound the Mahabharata is"? Is there any particular moment that you remember when you wrote this book?
Um, you know, I feel like I had that feeling throughout. I feel like I had that feeling throughout, and looking at the Book of Vows alone, I think that if I had to think of one, give me a moment while I think about this. Because it's hard to pick just one. It's hard to pick just one.
Like
I think
I
that
personally enjoyed, like I said, I personally enjoyed the you know the the rivalry and partition bit from a contemporary Indian perspective, which is why I picked it up from the book. 'Cause I was
yeah,
just wondering that if you had any. So I understand, like when you're writing the whole
yeah,
book, you're so immersed in the text. But yeah, for me,
right,
that the contrast between the 10th chapter and I think this is like later on in the book, the partition bit really stood out to me. I was like, these are such this is the cause and effect kind of an emotional thing. But yeah, so I understand that when you're writing a book
yeah.
like this and you're analyzing, you may not have that one moment, but yeah, as a reader I did.
I don't necessarily have one moment. I do feel that, and I'm jumping ahead because this is from the third volume. Um, for me, the my favorite part of the entire process of writing it. So I think the problem with when I was trying to answer your question has to do because I was focusing on the Book of Vows specifically. But if I'm thinking about the whole trilogy, I think the vision of the sons after the war, when Vyasa wades into the river, everyone's mourning and everyone's performing the funeral rites on the riverside, and Vyasa goes into the river and he sort of holographically projects the everybody who died in the war, and um, they're all happy in the afterlife, and they're all shaking hands and hugging each other and hugging it out in the afterlife. And he gives Dhritarashtra sight to see that, and to have that vision. And he gives everyone there, all the survivors, they're given this vision that he offers them. I just thought, and then thinking to myself that Vyasa is also the progenitor of all of these people. In he's the sort of the progenitor of them, and he's going to be the author of them as well, of the account of them. I just thought this was the most beautiful and kind of just redemptive and noble and almost consoling moment in the epic after so much bloodshed and carnage on Kurukshetra, that it was just something so profound, and it illuminated for me the heroic age ethos that I was talking about earlier, where there is not this intense demonization of the enemy into pure good on our side, pure evil on your side, which is something that you also see in Homer, where Hector is defeated, but he's noble in defeat. And the Greeks are victorious, but they're not necessarily perfect. And they're not, and Achilles is glowing and powerful, but he's not necessarily morally perfect as well. And even though, they say history is written by the victors, but and that's why the losing side is always so profoundly demonized, but that's us. And when the ancients wrote their epics, the losing side was not demonized in defeat, and it wasn't as though um, everything the victors did became good and noble and pure. And I thought, and I feel like that the vision of the sons was a perfect encapsulation in a single moment. It was a perfect encapsulation of that broad-minded, forgiving, and above all, understanding or comprehending mindset. And there's a French saying, "Tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner," which is to comprehend everything is to forgive everything. And I think to a certain extent, the vision of the sons, that particular sequence, that particular event, that particular scene, it has that feel to me. And I don't think it redeems the evil or the adharma that the Kauravas engaged in. It doesn't try and whitewash that. It doesn't try and pretend like that was all okay. But it does have this sense of understanding everything and forgiving everything, which I find very beautiful and very moving.
True. That's a very interesting anecdote. Amit, I had a great time reading your book.
Thank you so much for reading it. I'm touched. I'm honored. I'm honored.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because I'm more like a bare bones guy. I just read the text and leave it as it is, and that's about it. And then I try to find my own meaning of the text or critique of the text, whichever way somebody wants to look at it. And so I always find this exercise interesting, whether it's your book or whether it was Ganatra's book also, Mahabharata, on the Mahabharata. I always find it very interesting on why people pick certain bits. Why did you pick
Mhm,
this story vis-a-vis that
mhm,
story? And it's like these things,
mhm.
I mean, at the end of the day, you never get into the mind of the author completely, but I enjoyed reading your book, and I wish you all the best for the entire trilogy, and hopefully, looking forward to reading more and more of your work.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, we'll wrap today's podcast up. So, once again, if you're watching this on YouTube, in the description of the podcast, or listening to this on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you are on the audio platforms, you will see the link to buy Amit's book in the description of the podcast. So, go ahead, do your thing. You can also follow Amit on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. I have left his Twitter handle in the description of the podcast. Now, if you want to support this podcast runs on membership, so please become a member, whether it's on Patreon or on YouTube or on Fanmo for Indians. You can also send your donations to UPI, buy the merch on kushalmehra.com or Kadak merch. Or if you can't do anything, just like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment in the comment section. Tell me, maybe in the comment section, can you guys tell me excerpts from the Mahabharata that you have enjoyed? And if you're like a audio listener, just leave a rating on whatever audio platform you like. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste, take care, goodbye.